For CMAP6, I chose an article by Bridget Rodden, Paula Brendanville, Sheena Burke, and William Kinsella called Framing Secondary Teachers' Perspectives on the Inclusion of Students with Autism Spectrum Disorder Using Critical Discourse Analysis from the 2019 Cambridge Journal of Education, Volume 49, Number 2, page 235 through 253. Basically, this article was researching the role of teachers in supporting students with autism spectrum disorder in schools in the Republic of Ireland. And they primarily focused on secondary schools in the mainstream setting. And the study examined the theoretical and practical knowledge base of Irish secondary teachers regarding inclusion of learners with ASD, autism spectrum disorder in particular, and looked at the teachers' discourses to expose their sense of low self-efficacy in relation to pedagogical skills. And also at the school level, teachers position themselves outside of the dominant school discourse on special education needs. So that was basically the conclusion of the article. The language was critically analyzed using the socially constructed ideas gained through ideologies and experiences of the teachers, using language as a construct of power and the medical model of disability, and also the sociocultural perspective, which is the opposite view, basically. The sociocultural perspective identifies the marker of a disability as diversity, more as a positive thing than a negative thing. They value the whole person, not just the disability. They have a preference for vocabulary, and they also look at the individuality and the uniqueness of a person with a disability. The methods, this was a qualitative study in which there were interviews of secondary teachers, secondary mainstream teachers, and those interviews were analyzed using an in and out focus continuously. They would take the description of what the interviews said, then interpret that as a research team, and then provide an explanation using the critical discourse analysis. So what the analysis said was that there were several themes that emerged at the micro level, looking at the micro level, using the discourse as text. They identified that mainstream secondary teachers have difficulties with the entire concept of inclusion. They have both fear and anxiety in working with students with autism spectrum disorder in the mainstream classroom because they view them as dangerous students. And they also believe that the fact that students have a disability also means that they are not likely to make progress. At the macro level, which is on the school level, the school as a whole, some of the themes that were identified were that the school viewed an able learner over a disabled learner. The school does not particularly view the possibility of adapting their current school system to a child with disability, nor do they see it as something that they should do. And the mainstream secondary teachers also identified that the school system itself is the deficit in some instances, not the disability of the child. And in that same train of thought, secondary school system is not made for special education students. The mainstream teachers identified that how could you expect an individual with autism to go to several classes during the day, have numerous teachers during the day, and participate in classes for only 40 minutes at a time. So in the sense of how the school is run, they don't believe that students with autism spectrum disorder should be expected to participate in that sort of school system anyways. This macro level identifies the ideology and hegemony. Basically, it's also saying that these ideas and these elements at the macro level are a manifestation of the ineffective legislation and policies of the government in Ireland. And one thing in specific is that an IEP is not required in Ireland, even though many of the mainstream teachers do believe that it is helpful for students that have a disability to have an IEP. The policies and legislations of Ireland do not mandate that it's necessary. So that was on the macro level a way that teachers identified a problem. In looking at the discursive models of disability, there were a lot of themes that emerged from the idea of positioning, and discursive positioning was looked at in a variety of models. So there was discursive positioning as far as a special education department, and the mainstream teachers did not feel that they themselves were a part of that department, and they also felt that the special education department held power over them, and they were kind of the gatekeepers of the access to resources, to pedagogy styles that would work for students with disabilities. They saw the special education teacher or department as the expert on special needs, and they themselves, as the mainstream teacher, were the expert on the subject itself. They did not see themselves as a team or as necessary for them to work together. They also looked at the discursive positioning of the special education needs coordinator. And in Ireland, this is not an actual position, but more of a perception that the mainstream teachers have of the special education coordinator. It doesn't come with an extra title or extra pay, but yet the mainstream teachers feel that whoever the special education coordinator is should be the one to disseminate the power or disseminate the information, which in turn seems like there's more of a hierarchical power that's going on there. And they also felt that the mainstream teacher does not feel that they're sufficiently informed or knowledgeable to be able to contribute to what plans come about through the special education coordinator. So that was another conflict of power in the mainstream teacher's eyes. They also looked at the discursive positioning of the special needs assistant, and that person was really looked at originally as kind of like a health monitor or support for a child with a disability, and yet now the perception is more from the mainstream teacher in an inclusive setting that teaching assistant is actually more of a teaching aid for the teacher herself to scaffold the learning for the child, rather than the mainstream teacher being the one to create that scaffolding for the child. Another thing that was discussed during this article was just that there's some roles that have changed based on the idea of inclusion, or some perceptions of roles have changed based on the idea of inclusion, and mainstream teachers do not feel that they are a part of that change of perception. They feel that their role has stayed the same. or should stay the same, whereas the other elements of the key players for inclusion are the ones that are changing. And so in conclusion, while teachers have the desire to learn new pedagogy and to learn new strategies and to learn what works well with a particular student, they do not feel like they are supported by their schools and by their pre-service training with the proper training. And so one way that we can possibly help fill those gaps is through teacher prep programs. When teachers are in college, having them take more special education classes so that they do feel more prepared coming out the gate, and they don't feel like this is their student versus my student. It would be more of an our student from the get-go. And also the special education system is currently viewed as a hierarchical system. And in that sense, many people believe that inclusion just means integration. And with that concept, that idea, that is where we as a society need to consider making a change. Because if inclusion simply means integration, that means that the child or the person with a disability is expected to conform to what's already in society, rather than society making a change to incorporate the needs of that individual into school or society. And so one way that we can help with that is to decentralize authority and have more of horizontal communication and generalization across subject departments. Again, this is in the secondary school setting. And so typically at that stage, each department is in charge of their own subject area. So not necessarily like in elementary school, but in secondary. Let me know if you have any questions.